Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Week's digital show, Washington Week Recommends. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Each week, I recommend great reporting that I think deserves your attention. And today, I want to highlight a podcast series by Davis Dunavin. He's a reporter at WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut. His podcast is titled Still Newtown. It focuses on the Connecticut community that was devastated a decade ago after a gunman entered Sandy Hook Elementary School and killed 20 first-grade students and 6 educators. Davis reported on the mass shooting. At the time, his podcast focuses on how the community has dealt with the tragedy and its efforts to heal in the 10 years since. It's been so hard to think it's been already 10 years. So Davis, welcome to Washington Week Recommends. I'm so glad to have you here. You reported on Newtown. You reported on the shooting as it was happening and in the days and weeks and months afterwards. Tell me a bit about your experience there. Take us inside just how terrible it was. As someone who covered it for USA Today as a reporter, I remember just the shock and the surprise of that day. Tell me what you remember 10 years later.
Right. Well, I had been on the job for about 2 weeks. I just graduated from journalism school a few months before. I'd lived in Connecticut for less than a year. It was my first job out of school. And on November 30th, 2012, after working for the online site Patch for a few months, I was assigned to cover Newtown. And I knew very little about the town as a local reporter. What makes a good local reporter is building connections and building trust within the community. And 2 weeks isn't enough time to do that, And so when it happened, a lot of it was certainly a blur. I covered the community for about the next year. The first few weeks afterward were, as you may remember, news trucks, people on the streets, a very small town, or not a very small town. It's a town of about 30,000 people, but a town on the smaller side, inundated with people, with gifts and with attention. Over the next year, I saw the town change. I saw obviously the grief and the heartache and the hardship that we address in our podcast, but we also saw the beginnings of joy and kindness and love start to manifest in Newtown. And that's what we wanted to do in the series, really, is kind of cover both sides of that.
And Davis, I hear you talking, I think about just sort of my experience covering Newtown. And I was a young reporter like you. I had just gotten my first national job. And I remember sitting in my car and crying hysterically, frankly, because I was so overwhelmed by the evilness, the sadness of the moment. I wonder if you could just take people in who maybe weren't on the ground, just what it was like to see 6-year-olds. I would think of 6-year-olds in full suits going to see these tiny caskets. Take us in just a little bit more in the devastation of all of this. Well,
it's hard to think back on specific moments. You mentioned the 6-year-olds in caskets, and I think about a lot of the people that I met, the locals, and I'll share a story. Some of my colleagues and we had a really fantastic team of young reporters, young local reporters, and I remember when President Obama came, which maybe was 3-4 days after, and spoke at Newtown High School. We watched it from a local tavern and inn called the Inn at Newtown. And when it was over, one of my colleagues stood up and said, if anybody would like to speak, we'll be in the corner. Come and talk. We took a table, and we tried not to pressure anyone. And that's something I've really held to. Give people their space. People who want to be able to share their story should be able to share it. And people did. And people came and sat with us and talked with us. We heard stories about from local parents who had sort of it made them take another look at their relationship with their kid, and we spent the night talking with people about what they'd gone through. It was a moment I'll never forget.
Yeah, definitely a hard thing to forget. You named this podcast Still Newtown, talking about the perseverance. You talked about how the town has changed, the city has changed. What has changed? Tell me a little bit about the character of this place that you've been covering and what you found when you went back 10 years later.
Well, Newtown's a really interesting place. We do a whole episode called Not Defined by One Day, in which I wanted to celebrate a little bit the town that I saw. A town with its own quirks and its own, history and its own stories. Newtown is a town, like I said, of about 30,000 people, a little bit less, in the northern side of Fairfield County, just kind of on the edge of the New York metropolitan area. It's got a long colonial history. And what's changed there in the past 10 years, it's funny, when I started researching the story, I thought it was going to be about how Newtown changed. And we thought about things like reimagining Newtown and these concepts about, a whole new place. And we realized that, certainly some things changed, but the story was ultimately, and that's what the word still comes from, is about a town holding together, a town coming through this. But one new family that I talked to, who just moved to Newtown afterwards, actually, talked about coming to this town and realizing it was full of a lot of kindness and a lot of love and a lot of support. And I think that's something that came out of this in part. A lot of the parents who were affected, not all, everybody's story is different, but for some parents and some family members who lost loved ones, they started organizations, groups, campaigns to make the world a better place. I mean, one of my favorites is a woman named Jenny Hubbard who started an animal sanctuary in memory of her daughter Catherine. And I was actually just at the groundbreaking of that a few days ago. After 10 years, they broke ground to build a new facility, and they're caring for animals, which is what her daughter wanted. So I think you can point to a lot of ripple effects of kindness and love over the past 10 years.
And some of those ripple effects have also meant that some of these parents, that they've become gun reform advocates. They've become the people that you see at congressional hearings, the people that you see when there's gun legislation possibly coming up to sign or to be debated. Tell me a little bit about the parents and some of the survivors that have become political activists out of this.
Well, sure. So one of the things that interested me most was speaking with some of the survivors from the school, because now, this is an elementary school in 2012. The students now are in high school or college. A lot of them, Parkland, the shooting in Parkland in 2018 was certainly a moment that they remember very much. These kids have gotten involved. They've gone to vigils. They've become part of what is sometimes called the community of survivors. And they've lived their whole lives with this. If you just look year by year, Sutherland Springs, Las Vegas, Parkland, this year, Uvalde, Colorado Springs, Buffalo, so many more. I grew up in the 90s. I remember Columbine, but for me, mass shootings were not a regular fact of life. And for them, I think that's a very different story. And I think that's one of the reasons you see so many survivors get involved and get very vocal. Gen Z, for lack of a better term, they consider gun violence a major issue that can affect their lives very directly, and they're more vocal about it.
And you talked about the survivors that are 16 and 17 and some even in college. Apart from their activism, what sticks with you about the resilience and the spirit of these survivors?
Well, I mentioned, while we were reporting this, while we were doing our first interviews, we wanted to do it a little earlier in the year. And May 24th, when the Uvalde shooting really, changed a lot. And there's a parallel that struck out with me this year. I went to a rally just after the Uvalde shooting, and I remember this big banner that was laid out for people from Newtown to sign that was going to Uvalde. And it took me back to something that I saw shortly after the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School 10 years ago, when I was walking through the town municipal center and saw a banner sent to Newtown by Columbine, students at the Columbine High School. I mentioned that phrase, a community of survivors. When something like this happens, a few people told me, you kind of become part of a group. And there are ways that survivors can talk to each other and that they can't talk to other people. You have a sort of a sort of a shared reference point. So that's something that it's taken, I've spoken with some of these people over the years as their journeys have continued, and seen sometimes their frustration, sometimes, as I mentioned, their resilience. But as years go on and you see things change, you really notice it in them. And the more you speak with them, I mean, the more that story comes through.
And in talking about resilience and frustration, one of the things that I remember in covering Newtown, I felt like as a young reporter, the whole world was going to change. I remember President Obama basically saying, like, we have to do something about this. And we've seen some gun legislation passed, even after Uvalde, but you didn't, the shooting in Uvalde. But we haven't seen sort of a whole-scale change in gun laws. We haven't seen the sort of sweeping gun legislation that the survivors of Newtown, that the survivors of Uvalde and Buffalo and Pulse and so many other shootings are sort of pushing for. What do you make of that as a reporter? What did your sources in reporting this tell you about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely frustration from some, obviously from a lot of the young survivors, but also I think from, some of the adults. But I definitely saw frustration that we haven't had widespread federal legislation. But at the same time, activists told me there's been a lot of ground gained in state legislatures. Connecticut now has some of the strongest gun laws in the country, and those were passed after the tragedy. But, of course, there's 50 different state houses. I think a few of the people with a little more experience behind them tend to think of, if you know the prayer of serenity, right? God, give me the courage to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. A lot of people have to think very hard about what they can change. So, I think, for example, of Sandy Hook Promise, right, who have done a lot of work with, there's one of their slogans is know the signs, identifying warning signs of gun violence. Or, the Jesse Lewis Choose Love Foundation, or the Jesse Lewis Choose Love movement, rather, which is a social emotional learning curriculum for schools. So I think, parents have, and survivors and anybody who wants to make the world a better place is thinking about what they can do. And I wanted to capture kind of a cross section of that in the podcast.
And in talking about sort of the activism and just sort of that feeling of what can I do, there's this fairly new memorial to the Sandy Hook Elementary, to the victims, and commemorating that day, that tragedy. Talk a bit about that memorial and why people wanted to make sure that it was built.
Right. I mean, it's the story behind it, which is actually the last episode of our podcast, is a really interesting story. The memorial itself, it's beautiful. It's a pool of water with a tree in the middle. It's a sycamore. I think it's actually a sycamore hybrid, but to be specific. But and around this pool of water are the names of the 26 victims. It's really it's a beautiful place. It's close enough to Sandy Hook Elementary School, which was torn down and rebuilt in 2016, I believe. Close enough that, one of the members of the commission that helped build it said he could hear the sounds coming from the playground of kids at the school. But there's also, after the tragedy in 2012, Newtown was inundated with gifts, as you might imagine, a lot of gifts, tens of thousands of teddy bears, paper snowflakes, flowers, letters, artwork from around the world. They gave a lot of that to the parents, family members, teachers, and people in the Newtown community. But what was left over, they turned into what they called sacred soil. And as you enter the memorial, there's a quote from President Obama from when he spoke. And they actually incorporated that sacred soil, as they call it, into that part of the memorial. So it's really interesting kind of winding story of how it got to that point. But it is a beautiful memorial.
Wow, that is a very beautiful thing. And I want to ask you, you talked about sort of being a young reporter and not wanting to pressure people, and the sort of beauty and empathy that you showed and your colleagues showed in letting people come to you. I know I remember feeling that, like, you could tell you were entering a sacred space, that people were in such trauma that you didn't want to be sort of disruptive to that, right? I also wonder if you could tell me a little bit as a reporter, how you approached this podcast, what you were thinking about, especially because we're, of course, going to keep covering, unfortunately, stories like this. And I wonder if you could just tell our audience a little bit about just sort of your thinking as you were putting this together.
I wanted to make sure that we were, the phrase we sometimes hear is trauma-informed journalism. And I wanted to make sure that we were doing the best we could there to be sensitive, to be respectful, to tell the stories that people wanted, the stories of the people who wanted to share their stories. You know, I know that a lot of exploitative journalism has existed, and a lot of people have seen the effects of that, and I think rightfully so, are sometimes cautious about getting a call from a reporter. You know, people have a right not to be profiled or interviewed. But on the other side, there are people who have stories they want to share and they need to share. And sharing those stories can be a form of healing. So this is, by giving somebody a space to talk about what matters to them, you're doing your job as a journalist of amplifying an important voice. And I think about, one of my favorite poems is W.H. Auden's September 1st, 1939, in which he says, "All I have is a voice." I think about that line a lot. I think it means that for many of us, our meaning comes from telling what we've been through, right? Our voice is what we have. In my case, it's being there to give others the chance to talk about that. So, it's a phrase we sometimes hear a lot, but I think it's a true phrase, is bearing witness. It's about bearing witness.
Yeah. You definitely truly bore witness with this podcast. I hope everybody can take a listen to it. It's moving. It's such a good job. So thank you, Davis, for joining us and for sharing your reporting. And thanks to all of you, of course, for watching Washington Week Recommends. You can find us here every Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And tonight, of course, be sure to tune in to Washington Week on PBS. Tonight, we'll discuss the GOP infighting over government funding, new polls on former President Trump's favorability and their decline, and President Biden's U.S.-Africa summit. So tune in tonight, and we'll see you then. Thanks.